everybody. Welcome to kind of a special edition of Anna Reads. I hope the Alice Disney bound translates. If it doesn't, well, kind of tough. That's what I had laying around. But today we have the chapter I've kind of been looking forward to the most. We have a very special beginning in Unit 2, Chapter 8 of Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. The birth of Mickey Mouse is obscured in legend, much of it created by Walt Disney himself. He enjoyed telling the tale of how he dreamed up the mouse character on the train trip back from the Oswald disaster, and how Lily objected to the name of Mortimer Mouse, and so he made it Mickey Mouse instead. He also hinted that the character originated with a pet mouse that played around his drawing board in Kansas City. Both stories had basis in fact, but the real genesis of Mickey Mouse appears to have been an inspired collaboration between Walt Disney, who supplied the zestful personality and the voice for Mickey, and Ub Iwerks, who gave Mickey form and movement. When Walt and Lily arrived at the Santa Fe station on a March Sunday morning in 1928, he gave no hint to Roy of the catastrophe that had befallen their enterprise in New York. Not until they arrived at their twin homes did Roy finally inquire, "Tell me about it, kid. What kind of a deal did you make?" Walt admitted cheerfully, "We haven't got a deal," and he related the events leading up to the final break with Mintz. Oh, I wish I could say what I really want to say about that guy. But before Roy could become depressed, Walt quickly added, "We're going to start a new series." Walt and Roy agreed on the new venture. Now they faced the problem of how to get it started. 3 more Oswalds had to be completed and delivered to Mintz, and the defecting cartoonists would not be leaving until June. Walt and Ub concocted a storyline to capitalize on the recent transatlantic flight of Charles Lindbergh, and Ub began the animation behind a locked door. If someone knocked, he quickly buried the new drawings and substituted Oswald. Ub drew the new cartoon, titled Plain Crazy, at a phenomenal rate, 700 drawings a day, breaking Bill Nolan's record of 600 a day for Crazy Cat. The rest of the animation process was not easy to hide within the studio, so Walt built a makeshift workshop in his garage on Lyric Avenue. Lily, Edna and Walt's sister-in-law Hazel Sewell did the inking and painting of Ub's animation. Walt took the completed cells to the studio at night, and a loyal employee, Mike Marcus, operated the camera. Each morning before the animators arrived, all evidence of Plain Crazy was removed. The cartoon was completed and scheduled for a preview at a Sunset Boulevard movie house on May 15, 1928. As was his custom at previews, Walt handed the theater organist $1 so the cartoon gags would be punched over with music. The reception was good, though not overwhelming, and Walt was encouraged to begin production on a second picture, The Galloping Gaucho. Now he was able to make the cartoon without the cloak and dagger secrecy. The Oswald renegades had left. Their departure had perplexed a newcomer at the studio, Wilfred Jackson. During his first week, the former art student noted that the animators laughed and chattered over their work, but on Saturday they took their seat cushions, visors, and other personal things with them. "They're a strange bunch," Jackson mused. "They have fun together all week, but they don't trust each other enough to leave their personal belongings at the studio." On the following Monday, he learned what had happened when only Ub, Les Clark, Johnny Cannon, 3 of the woman inkers, and the janitor returned to work. Walt sought a distributor for Mickey Mouse. He showed Plain Crazy to executives at MGM. They congratulated him, but made no offer. Realizing that the series would have to be sold in New York, where the major companies maintained their business offices, Walt engaged a New York film dealer, E.J. Dennison to find a distributor. I feel that I can make good cartoons and that they can be placed with a good distributor if the matter is handled right, Walt wrote Dennison. But the time is short and there would be no second chance this year if we got off on the wrong foot. Walt wanted an advance of $3,000 per cartoon and was willing to grant 1 or 2 year operations for 26 cartoons annually at a minimum length of 500 feet. He concluded, "It is our intention to carry on an advertising and exploitation campaign that should, in a very short time, along with good pictures and a good release, make the name of Mickey Mouse as well known as any cartoon on the market." Dennison tried to interest major distributors in Mickey Mouse, but the results were discouraging. Dennison withdrew, and Walt was faced with an unsold series and mounting costs. Meanwhile, the revolution of sound had commenced. Except for a few abortive experiments, the motion picture had been mute throughout its history. On October 6, 1927, with the premiere of The Jazz Singer at the Warner's Theater in New York City, the motion picture medium was changed forever, although most of the film moguls were slow to realize it. Not Walt Disney. I've never seen The Jazz Singer except for like little bitty clips and bits and pieces, and Jolson sings all right, but that film has not aged well at all. He recognized sound as an inevitable addition to the art of animation. Even though the first 2 Mickey Mouse cartoons had not found a buyer, he planned a third, this one to be synchronized to sound. Walt and Ub borrowed from a successful Buster Keaton comedy for the third Mickey Mouse, Steamboat Willie. The action in the first part of the cartoon was to be syncopated to an old vaudeville tune, Steamboat Bill, the last half to Turkey in the Straw. But how the hell do we match the sound to the action of a cartoon, Walt pondered. He himself had only a passing acquaintance with music. Wilfred Jackson, whose mother was a music teacher, brought a metronome to the studio, and he and Walt devised a way to time music to the flow of film through a sound camera. 24 frames per second. While Jackson played on his harmonica, Walt calculated on a blank music sheet how many frames of cartoon would be required to match the tune. The mechanics had been solved, but would audiences accept dialogue and song from cartoon characters? For a quarter century, Crazy Cat, Coco, Oswald, and all the other animated figures had spoken not a word, and cartoon producers feared the tenuous illusion of reality might be destroyed when the characters opened their mouths to speak. On a warm July night, Walt invited his workers to bring their wives to the studio. Roy operated the projector outside a window to lessen the noise of film running through sprockets. Walt, Wilfred Jackson, Johnny Cannon, and Ub stood behind the bedsheet screen in front of a microphone. As Mickey and the villain Pete appeared on the screen, Jackson played Steamboat Bill on his harmonica. Interestingly enough, my next-door neighbors have a black and white cat named Pete, and I was explaining to my neighbor that Pete was the very first Disney villain. And she kind of blinked and shook her head at me, but I think eventually she got the reference. Ub accompanied him with washboard and sliding whistles. Cannon punctuated the action with sound effects, and Walt delivered the minimal dialogue. Each man in turn went out in front of the bedsheet to observe the illusion as the reel was replayed, and each concluded that the device would work. The wives, Walt noted, were more concerned with discussions of babies and recipes. Steamboat Willie was completed as a silent, with music and sound effects cued by marks on the film. Talkies had created chaos in Hollywood, with major companies monopolizing sound equipment and thwarting efforts of independent producers to convert their films to sound. The Disney brothers concluded that Walt should use their remaining resources to journey alone to New York, where sound systems were more readily available. Walt stopped in Kansas City to confer with his old friend Carl Stalling, the theater organist who had advanced the brothers $275 when they needed it badly. Walt persuaded him to perform another service, and Stalling hastily composed a musical score for Steamboat Willie, timing it to the beats that Ub had marked on the film. With the can of film under his arm and the musical score in his suitcase, Walt arrived confidently in New York on the day after Labor Day, 1928. He found the film industry in a state resembling Paris of 1789. It's a bit of a strong analogy, I must say. The sound revolution had brought disarray to all the film companies, with producers scrambling to find recording systems that were efficient and cheap. Walt called on Jack Alicote, the trade paper editor, who referred him to experts in sound recording. Some of them advised Walt to record on phonograph records, as several of the big companies were doing. Walt was unconvinced. A record could get lost or broken, he reasoned, and the projectionist could start the record in the wrong groove. If you, like I, have any experience with vinyl, oh yeah. You start on the wrong groove and you get blasted in the face with the wrong brass section of an Irving Berlin arrangement. No thank you. With sound and action out of synchronization, the illusion would be destroyed. Walt was convinced that the sound had to be recorded on the film itself. He began making the rounds. Fox was too busy taking orders for its movie tone system to bother with a small cartoon maker from the coast. RCA brusquely agreed to take on the assignment. Walt insisted on seeing what the company could do. He was shown an experiment in recording an Aesop's Fables cartoon. Walt wrote his reaction to Roy and Ub. "My gosh, terrible. A lot of racket and nothing else. I was terribly disappointed. I really expected to see something halfway decent, but honestly, it was nothing but one of the rottenest fables I believe that I ever saw, and I should know because I have seen almost all of them. The talking part does not mean a thing. It doesn't even match. We sure have nothing to worry about from these quarters." RCA said it would accept the recording of Steamboat Willie for $600 plus the cost of an orchestra, a $1,000 royalty charge, a music tax to be paid to the publisher, etc. "They are not anywhere within our reach. I have dropped them from my mind entirely," Walt wrote to California. As Walt continued his dealings with the New York film world, he became more convinced of the future of sound. He wrote to Roy and Ub that talkies were still a mystery to most of the movie executives. "None of them are positive how it is all going to turn out, but I have come to this definite conclusion. Sound effects and talking pictures are more than a mere novelty. They are here to stay, and in time will develop into a wonderful thing. The ones that get in on the ground floor are the ones that will more likely profit by its future development. That is, providing they work for quality and not quantity and quick money. Also, I am convinced that the sound on film is the only logical thing for the future. At the present, it is necessary to have both in order to cover the field 100%. The merchant of sound who most impressed Walt was P.A. Pat Powers, who owned an independent system called Cinephone. Oh, I've heard of Pat Powers before. And if you've seen Saving Mr. Banks, you have too. He is a dandy, Walt enthused in his letter home, relating an entire afternoon spent with the movie executive. Powers introduced the young man from Hollywood to a fellow movie actor, George Walsh, whom Walt described as a fine fellow. He was telling me how to play polo and about what a great sport it was. Walt also met Carl Eduard. I'm not sure on this last name either. It's Edouarde. I want to say Eduard. A conductor of the pit orchestra at the Strand Theatre. A dandy fellow. Big salary, but he knows his stuff. Eduard expressed eagerness to record the cartoon, and he could do it with 5 or 6 pieces and a couple of sound effects men. Powers proposed a charge of $1,000, including a royalty on the Disney films, and he offered to use his connections to help arrange a releasing company. I have made up my mind to score it with Powers, Walt wrote to Roy. Later, Walt was to learn that Pat Powers was known to the film trade as one of the great New York City slickers, his shenanigans in the early days of movies having become legend. An Irish blacksmith from Buffalo, Powers shouldered his way into the infant business by bootlegging cameras from the Patents Company, which owned the rights to film equipment. In 1912, Powers battled with Carl Laemmle for control of Universal. One day, Powers and a gang of strong-arm men claimed the props and furniture at Universal and carried them away in vans. During a board meeting at 1600 Broadway, Powers declined to turn over the company's financial records to Laemmle. Instead, he threw them out the third-floor window. Laemmle eventually bought out his antagonist, and Powers continued his dealings in the industry. By 1928, he had returned to his beginnings, using pirated equipment. His Cinephone system was based on other people's patents. The 26-year-old cartoon maker from California was overwhelmed by Powers' Irish charm. Walt wrote home, "Powers is a very big and influential guy. He is all wrapped up in his work. He is personally taking care of me. He is big enough that if he wants Adolf Zukor, head of Paramount, to look at it, he simply calls him and says, 'Come on over, Adolf, and give it a look.'" I have several things to say about Pat Powers as well, but I think I'll keep them to myself, shall I? Especially here on Easter Sunday. Walt gave Powers a deposit of $500, telling Roy to be sure and have enough money in the account to meet the check. Walt had been in New York City only a week, but already he was wearying of big city life and even Steamboat Willie itself. Personally, I am sick of this picture, Steamboat Willie. Every time I see it, the lousy print spoils everything. Maybe it will be a different-looking picture with sound. I sure hope so. I am very nervous and upset, and I guess that has a lot to do with my attitude in the matter. This damn town is enough to give anybody the heebie-jeebies. I sure wish I was home. I sure wouldn't make a good traveling salesman. I can't mix with strangers and enjoy myself like some people. This is not affecting my attitude toward the matter I came here for. That is the only thing that is on my mind. But I have so much time to kill at night that I almost go nuts. But in the letter, he quickly recovered from depression and urged Ub to go forward with the 4th Mickey Mouse cartoon, the barn dance. When the time came for the recording session, Walt learned that 17 musicians would be required, plus 3 trap drummers and sound effects men. I argued till I was blue in the face for a very small orchestra, Walt wrote Roy, offering the consolation, "This is our first picture. It has got to be a wow. On the strength of it, we are going to sell the entire series." After the recording session on September 15th, Walt telegraphed Roy, "Tone value perfect, but results are not satisfactory. Stop. All concerned desire best results obtainable, therefore are remaking it using different effects. Effectsmen. I am very optimistic about results, and our future looks bright. Stop. Gave Powers check 1,000. Be sure it is okay." Walt had tried to hide his own crushing disappointment over the expensive failure. Conductor Edouard had disregarded Walt's system of synchronizing music to film, declaring he could match the action by watching the screen, but the cartoon moved too fast for the musicians to follow. In California, Roy was struggling to find money for another recording session. Walt contributed what to him was an extreme sacrifice. Roy was given permission to sell Walt's beloved Moon Roadster. "I am figuring on a good release," Walt assured Roy and Ub. "I don't think we will have any trouble getting it. This may mean the making of a big organization out of our little dump. Why should we let a few dollars jeopardize our chances? I think this is old man opportunity rapping on our door. Let's don't let the jingle of a few pennies drown out his knock. See my point? So slap as big a mortgage on everything we got, and let's go after this thing in the right manner." Walt sat at midnight in his lonely room at the Hotel Knickerbocker and typed 4-page single-spaced letters about his New York experiences. Sometimes his desperation showed through. "Well, fellows, I have told you all I know and then some. It is very hard to put the entire situation on paper. Try and read between the lines. If you knew the entire situation as I do, I feel sure you wouldn't be able to sleep or eat. I can't." But in most of the letters, he retained his native optimism, and when he ended his October 1st message, "All together now, are we downhearted? Hell no." The hell no was typed in red. For the second recording session, Walt filmed a moving ball on the frames of the film to indicate the musical beats. He persuaded Edouard to cut down the size of the orchestra and hire only 2 special effects men. Walt himself supplied Mickey's squeaks, Minnie Mouse's shouts, and the voice of a parrot calling, "Man overboard! Man overboard!" In 2018, Mickey and Minnie both celebrated their 90th birthdays, and I would like to say that my favorite mice are aging quite well. I hope I'm doing as well if I make it to 90. This time, Edouard followed the beat marks on the screen, and the orchestra finished in perfect synchronization with the film. At last, Steamboat Willie had sound. Now all Walt had to do was sell it. Pat Powers arranged for showings at the offices of the major distributors, and Walt went from one to another with the same result. He appeared before the receptionist and said, "I'm Walt Disney and I have a cartoon to show." He was directed to a company official who told him, "Just put it in the projection room and we'll get to it as soon as we can." Walt sometimes waited at the projection room for hours as the movie men watched their own product. Finally, one of them said, "Oh, that cartoon thing that fella brought over. Put it on." Finally, Mickey Mouse and Pete appeared on the screen, and Walt Disney listened carefully to determine if their antics got laughs. They did, but when Walt asked for an opinion, the executives replied, "We'll call you about it," or "We'll be in touch with Pat Powers." But no one came up with an offer. Walt's dealings with the film crowd brought both disillusion and wariness. "I have certainly learned a lot about this game already," he wrote Lilly on October 20th. "It is the damnedest mixed-up affair I have ever heard of. It sure demands a shrewd and thoroughly trained mind to properly handle it. There are so damned many angles that continually come up that if a person hasn't the experience, etc., it would certainly lick one. They are all a bunch of schemers and just full of tricks that would fool a greenhorn. I am sure glad I got someone to fall back on for advice. I would be like a sheep amongst a pack of wolves. I have utmost confidence and faith in Powers, and believe that if we don't try to rush things too fast, that we will get a good deal out of this. We will all just have to have patience and confidence. I am very optimistic about everything and want you all to feel the same way. I really think our big chance is here." Walt was convinced that Steamboat Willie was a winner, and he couldn't understand why the companies weren't flocking to sign up a series of Mickey Mouse cartoons. It was explained to him by a show business veteran, Harry Reichenbach. "Those guys don't know what's good until the public tells them." Reichenbach was a colorful promoter-publicist who was operating the Colony Theater in New York for Universal Pictures. He had seen Steamboat Willie during one of the projection room screenings and thought it would create a sensation. "I want to put that cartoon in the Colony," he said. "Gee, I don't know," Walt replied. "I'm afraid that if I run it at a Broadway house, it'll take the edge off my chances to sell it to a distributor." "No, it won't," said the persuasive Reichenbach. "You can chase that cartoon all over town and those companies won't buy. Not until the public tells them it's good. Let me run it for 2 weeks so the press can see it. You'll get good reviews and the people will come in droves. I'll get you $500 a week." Walt was immediately convinced. That was more money than anyone had ever paid to play a cartoon in a single theater. The $1,000 was desperately needed to shore up the Disney finances. Steamboat Willie opened at the Colony Theater on November 18th, 1928, and it was a sensation that Walt had dreamed it would be. The bill featured a talking movie, Gang War, starring Olive Borden and Jack Pickford, and a stage show headed by Ben Burney and his orchestra. Excuse me. Mickey missed my own birthday by 5 days, but he's still Scorpio. We'll count it. Sorry, I always tear up when I get to this part. But the patrons left the theater talking about Steamboat Willie, billed as the first animated cartoon with sound. Variety reported, "It's a peach of a synchronization job all the way, bright, snappy, and fitting the situation perfectly, with most of the animated cartoons qualifying as a pain in the neck. It's a signal tribute to this particular one, recommended unreservedly for all wired houses." Weekly Film Review. It kept the audience laughing and chuckling from the moment the lead titles came on the screen, and it left them applauding. Exhibitor's Herald. It is impossible to describe this riot of mirth, but it knocked me out of my seat. Just for everyone's information, Steamboat Willie is streaming on Disney Plus as of this recording, which is April 12th, 2020. So I encourage you, go give it a watch. Please, you're watching history. Even the New York Times took note of the first sound cartoon by Walt Disney, described as the creator of Oswald the Rabbit and now of a new cartoon character, henceforth to be known as Mickey Mouse. The Times conceded that the film was an ingenious piece of work with a good deal of fun. It growls, whines, squeaks, and makes other various sounds that add to its mirthful quality. Night after night, Walt stood at the back of the theater and listened to the warm, fresh waves of laughter that greeted the cartoon images on the screen. Reichenbach had been right. At last, the film companies were calling Walt Disney to come in and discuss a deal. Walt was so encouraged by the prospects that he sent for Carl Stalling to join him and start writing the scores for Plain Crazy and the Gallopin' Gaucho. Walt's homesickness showed in his letters to California. He began one to Lily. Dear little sweetheart, I have just returned from a little shopping tour. I bought me a pair of pigskin gloves, something like the ones I used to have. It is so cold here now that I really needed them. It is about 6 o'clock now, and I haven't had anything to eat since about 9 o'clock this morning. Carl developed a headache about 2 o'clock and had to go to bed. He is just sort of upset over the trip. I am as hungry as the devil right now, but will wait until he is ready. By that time, I will sure be good and hungry. I wish I could sit down to one of my mama's meals. I'm sorry. I think that's one of the sweetest mundane letters I've ever read. The talks with film distributors followed the same pattern. They asked how much he wanted to be paid each week for producing Mickey Mouse. He replied that he didn't want to be paid by the week, that he had his own studio and wanted to remain independent. Forgive me while I clean myself up here for a second. There's not a Kleenex within reach. I try my best generally not to sniffle in polite company. They answered that they would either hire him by the week or buy the cartoons outright. No, said Walt. He had to own the cartoons himself. No deal, said the distributors. The only company that gave Walt encouragement was Universal, for whom he had created Oswald. When Walt reported to the Universal offices for a conference, he was startled to find Charles Mintz waiting in the reception room. "92 years later, and Charles Mintz is driving me to drink. I can only imagine what it did to Walt." Walt did not believe in bearing grudges, and he gave a cordial greeting to the man who had taken away Oswald and most of the Disney staff. "Oh, that's being a bigger person than I think I would be. My mom raised me right, but you can only push me so far, you know." Moving on, moving forward. Inside, the Universal bosses said they wanted Mickey Mouse and would give Walt a contract assuring a healthy profit, but Universal would retain control. The offer was tempting, but Walt still said no. "I agree with you," said Pat Powers. "You should remain independent, and I am willing to help you. I want to promote Cinephone. That's my only interest, promoting Cinephone. Your Mickey Mouse can do it for me. I'll make you a better deal than any of the majors. I'll sell rights to the cartoons in each state, and I'll pay for the salesmen and all the expenses. I'll advance you the money you need to make the cartoons, and I'll take only 10% of the gross. Please excuse me, I'm being extremely ungraceful right now, but my lord, that letter was sweet. It's the dear little sweetheart that gets me, okay? The offer seemed far more attractive than any from the major companies, and Walt agreed to it. He and Carl Stalling added sound to Plain Crazy, The Gallopin' Gaucho, and the newly completed The Barn Dance. Walt's New York ordeal was over at last, and he could return to Lily in triumph. He came home with a brand new contract and $2,500 in cash, more money than he had ever seen before. Roy considered the Powers contract far from triumphant. For the first time since they had entered business together, the two brothers had a stormy argument. Shaking the contract at Walt, Roy exploded. "Did you read this? Do you know what you promised?" He read the provisions for Disney to pay $26,000 a year for 10 years' use of the Cinephone equipment. "What the hell," Walt replied. "I needed the equipment." Oh. Powers shipped the sound system to the Hyperion studio, and Walt began producing Mickey Mouse sound cartoons. His animation staff was expanding as the result of his recruitment of cartoonists in New York. Ben Sharpstein and Bert Gillette, joined him in the spring of 1929, and Jack King and Norm Ferguson arrived a few months later. The spark plug of the staff remained Ub Iwerks, who turned out a prodigious number of drawings every day. He timed the action to a musical beat, since the Mickeys were scored by Carl Stalling with songs. The timing was recorded on an exposure sheet, which Ub kept by his animation table. The exposure sheet caused the first squabble between Walt and Ub. Stitch! Stitch! Something's got my dog stirred up. Would you quit it? You tell him. Nearly every night, Walt returned to the studio to attend to business matters and to review the cartoon work that had been done that day. Lily often accompanied him and fell asleep on the couch while he worked until early morning. Walt studied Ub's drawings and prepared exposure sheets for them. Ub seldom displayed emotion, but he was upset by this invasion of his artistic function. Walt's timing was not what he had planned, Ub snapped, and he wanted no such interference. Walt agreed to let Ub make his own exposure sheets. On his next visit to New York, Walt witnessed the growing popularity of Mickey Mouse. He wrote Lily that The Barn Dance went over very well at the Strand Theater on Broadway, and he added, "The Strand has a big cutout of Mickey in the lobby and gives it as much space as any of their other sound shorts. I am enclosing a program. This shows how much prominence they give it." Mickey Mouse is getting to be a very familiar character on Broadway. He is what is known as a hit. The exchange men that buy them all give lots of praise for their cleverness. They all claim that they are the cleverest sound shorts on the market. All the salesmen consider it their best asset in approaching customers. I am thankful for all the nice things that are said about them, and I hope we will be able to prove to them that it is not an accident, but a consistent standard. My brother Jareth has a little formula for is something a fluke, a coincidence, or a pattern. Once is a fluke, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is a pattern. It's pretty scary accurate. Walt was immensely pleased with Mickey's ascendancy, but he had vague misgivings. Prosperity would permit him to build his organization and heighten the quality of the cartoons, but the studio would be forced to produce shorts, one after another, starring the same character. Walt had gone through that with Alice and Oswald, and he found it stultifying. Now, isn't that a word? Stultifying. During a New York recording session, Carl Stalling suggested a different kind of cartoon, a graveyard frolic to be animated to Grieg's March of the Dwarfs. When Walt returned to the studio, he and Ub devised a storyline with skeletons floating out of graves and dancing a bony gavotte. The skeleton dance remains one of my favorite pieces of animation to this day. Spooky kids forever. I can't tell if I'm going to laugh or cry next. I'm sorry. Les Clark contributed some of the animation, but most of it was done by Ub, working with more than his usual industry. He insisted on animating every frame of his sequences, and his stubbornness led to arguments with Walt, who reasoned that it was wasteful for the studio's best animator to make drawings that the in-betweeners could readily accomplish. The incident brought further friction between Walt and Ub. But Walt, in a February 9th, 1929 letter, when he returned to New York, sent encouragement to his chief collaborator. I am glad the spook dance is progressing so nicely. Give her hell, Ub. He actually spells the fella's legal name, U-B-B-E. I'm reasonably sure there's a difference in pronunciation between U-B-B-E and just U-B. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. Make it funny, and I am sure we will be able to place it in a good way. I have them all worked up and raring to see it, so we can't disappoint them. We have a wonderful score to it. The music sounds like a little symphony. I feel positive everything will fit the picture properly. On the following day, he wrote to Lily, I feel positive the spook dance will make a real hit when shown. Everyone praises Ubbe's artwork and jokes at his funny name. The oddness of Ubbe's name is an asset in a way. It makes people look twice when they see it. Tell Ubbe that the New York animators take off their hats to his animation and all of them know who we are. If you know me in real life, you know I have a bit of an unusual last name, and I wouldn't give it up for anything for the exact same reason. You have to look twice at that one. Walt planned to release the Skeleton Dance as the first of a new series of cartoons to be called Silly Symphonies, each a new subject without continuing characters. The series would permit him and his animators to experiment with new story material and new techniques. He dispatched a print of the Skeleton Dance to Pat Powers, suggesting that he screen it for potential customers. Powers replied, "They don't want this. More mice." Walt was certain Powers was wrong, and he arranged to show the Skeleton Dance one morning at a downtown Los Angeles theater. Walt sensed the small audience's enjoyment of the cartoon, but the manager declared, Can't recommend it. Too gruesome." Boy, would he feel right silly at the Night on Bald Mountain sequence later. Walt sought a film salesman of his acquaintance, locating him in a pool hall. Walt was convinced the Skeleton Dance could be booked at the prestigious Carthay Circle Theater if the owner, Fred Miller, could be induced to look at it. "All right, leave the print. I'll get in touch with you," said the salesman, returning to his game. Miller saw the Skeleton Dance, liked it, and booked the cartoon into the Carthay Circle. The response was overwhelming, and Walt sent the reviews to Pat Powers with the suggestion that Samuel L. Rothafel, the famed Broadway showman, might be convinced to play the cartoon at his giant Roxy Theater. His hunch proved right, and the engagement at the Roxy proved the impetus to launch the silly symphonies. Mickey Mouse flourished into a national craze in 1929. Mickey Mouse clubs sprang up all over the country, and the cry of the anguished moviegoer, "What? No Mickey Mouse?" became a catchphrase. It originated in a cartoon in the Old Life magazine. The seeming prosperity of the Disney enterprise was illusory. Walt insisted on greater qualities in the Mickeys and the Symphonies, and the cost per cartoon climbed to $5,000. Walt expected the added expense to be balanced by receipts from Pat Powers, but weeks passed without any checks from New York. Roy Disney went to New York in an attempt to straighten out finances with Powers. Roy was treated to the Powers Irish charm and fiscal obfuscation, and he returned with his suspicions confirmed. "The guy's a crook," Roy told his brother. "Go back there and see for yourself." The brothers agreed that they needed legal assistance, and they hired a colorful attorney named Gunther Lessing, who had advised Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolutionary's heyday. Walt reasoned, if he could help Pancho Villa, he's just the man we need. In January 1930, Lilly and Gunther Lessing departed for New York and the confrontation with Pat Powers. Walt went alone to the first meeting, which began with Powers' insistence that he was still only interested in promoting Cinephone. The success of Mickey Mouse had been merely a happy side effect. He was offhanded about the cartoon series, but in reality he was desperate to sign again with Disney when the one-year contract expired. Powers pressed for a continuation of the contract, but Walt insisted first on an accounting of Powers' receipts from the cartoons. Shrugging off the demand, the Irishman said he had news that would convince the Disneys to sign again with Pat Powers. He handed over a telegram. It was a message from Powers' henchmen on the West Coast that Iworks had been signed to a contract with Powers to create a new cartoon series at a salary of $300 a week. Walt was stunned. Walt and Ub had grown up together in the animation business. They had worked side by side for long nights to make successes of Alice, of Oswald and Mickey. Ub had invested part of his salary in the company, and Walt and Roy had made him a 20% owner and an officer of the firm. "I can't believe it," Walt muttered. "It's true," Powers said with a smile. "Pick up the phone and call your brother. He knows about it. Go ahead, call." Walt was too shaken to telephone Roy. "Don't get upset," Powers continued. "You haven't lost Iworks. You can still have him, if you sign with me." Walt shook his head. "No, I wouldn't want him. If he feels that way, I couldn't work with him." "Look," Powers said, "you and your brother need money. I'll make you a deal that will relieve you of the concern about money matters. I'll pay you a weekly salary. I'm willing to go as high as $2,500 a week." Powers was surprised that his munificent offer failed to impress the young cartoon maker. Walt was still trying to grasp the news that Ub had left him. Roy confirmed it by telephone when Walt returned to his room at the Algonquin Hotel. Ub had come to Roy that day and said he wanted to be released from the partnership. Ub said that artistic differences had developed between him and Walt. He made no mention of the Powers contract. Gunther Lessing later negotiated an agreement that dissolved Ubb's contract with Disney and paid him $2,920 for his 1/5 interest. Hypothetically, if iWorks had retained his share in the company, its market value would have reached $4 billion. Walt contemplated the situation. By January of 1930, he had delivered 12 Mickey Mouse cartoons of the first series, 3 of the second series, and 6 silly symphonies. The cost of the cartoons had been $116,500 or $5,500 per picture. He knew that Powers had been collecting big rentals for the cartoons, almost $17,000 apiece. But by the time Powers took his 35% as distributor, plus costs for prints, processing, advertising, censorship fees, licensing, insurance, music rights, recording fees, print royalties, and foreign dubbing, there was little left for the Disneys. Walt remembered Roy's instructions. Don't break with Powers until we get some dough. When they met again, Walt told Powers that his brother had insisted they needed more money at the studio. Certainly, said Powers magnanimously. Will $5,000 be all right? Walt agreed that it would, and he immediately dispatched the check to Roy in California. Walt and Gunther Lessing conferred about their next move. Both agreed that Walt should demand to see Powers' account of receipts from the Disney films. Powers proposed his counteroffer. Make a deal with me and I'll show you the books. Make a deal, my tushy. The alternative, he indicated, was to take him to court, a process which would require time and money that the Disney brothers could ill afford. Walt and Roy discussed whether to provoke a fight with Powers and try to recover the revenue they deserved, or simply walk away from the shifty promoter and begin anew. They decided to walk away. Walt broke off the negotiations with Powers and began talking to other distributors about a release. Unlike his experience of a year before, he was now welcomed into the home offices of the major companies as father of the famous Mickey Mouse. Felix Feist, sales manager of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, is it Mayer or Meyer? I've never been sure, strongly recommended a contract for the Mickey Mouse and Silly Symphony series, but after 4 days of deliberations, the MGM attorneys decided against it. The ubiquitous Pat Powers had issued threats to sue any company that signed a contract for the Disney cartoons. Columbia Pictures was not so timid. The company's belligerent founder, Harry Cohn, was then bullying his way into the ranks of important producers, and his director, Frank Capra, advised him to make a deal with the brilliant young cartoon maker. Cohn offered $7,000 advance for each cartoon. Importantly, Columbia established a war fund of $25,000 to combat Pat Powers if he tried to contest the new contract. Powers was enough of a realist to recognize his defeat. He suggested a settlement by which he would relinquish the 21 Disney cartoons in return for a cash settlement. The figure he mentioned was more than $100,000. Walt wanted to be rid of Powers and to regain control of his films. He agreed to pay Powers the tribute, even though he believed that the old pirate owed him much more. Walt arranged a $50,000 loan from Columbia to conclude the deal. Walt telegraphed the news to Roy on February 7th, 1930. Have definitely broke with Powers. Stop. Will deliver no more pictures. Stop. plan to temporarily suspend production Mickeys and concentrate on Symphonies, which we will deliver to Columbia. Walt returned to Columbia with the hope that a new distributorship would afford enough financial independence so he could devote full energies to improving the quality of the cartoons. But once more that independence was to prove elusive. Walt's almost total immersion in his work contributed to his nervous breakdown in 1931. He had been pushing himself and his animators hard, seeking greater quality in the cartoons instead of coasting on his already substantial reputation. There were inevitable disappointments. Some of his artists met the challenges he gave them, others did not. Each failure was a personal defeat to Walt. The financial troubles returned. For all the euphoria that marked the beginning of the Columbia contract, Walt and Roy found themselves in the same fiscal squeeze that they had known with Pat Powers. With each new cartoon, the brothers seemed to slip deeper in debt. Walt kept adding to his payroll, and he instructed his animators to take more care with their drawings. That always meant more expense. Animation was an anomaly in the motion picture business. The normal movie could be made cheaply or expensively, according to the cost of the talent and the production values. A cartoon was handcrafted, 15,000 pictures drawn, inked, and painted for each 7-minute film. A cartoon could not be made with less tedium, and any refinement of the technique inexorably pushed costs higher. Animation as practiced by Walt Disney would always be a perilous enterprise, with prosperous times when the product succeeded and the threat of insolvency when it didn't. Money worries and the stress of a leading crew of volatile, talented artists through uncharted territory began to wear on Walt. He became more irritable with his employees, snapping at them for minor offenses. A sudden disappointment could plunge him into a crying spell. He spent sleepless hours in bed at night, staring at the ceiling as he reviewed the day's events and planned the future. In story sessions, his mind went blank and he couldn't recall what was being discussed. He consulted a doctor who advised him to leave the studio and take a complete rest. Walt and Lily decided to take their first non-business trip since their honeymoon 5 years before. Roy took charge of the studio, and Walt and Lily left to fulfill his ambition on his return from France, to voyage down the Mississippi River. But when they visited the St. Louis waterfront, they discovered that only barges floated down the Mississippi. The Depression had wiped out the passenger trade. The Disneys boarded a train for their first trip to Washington, D.C. When they registered at the Mayflower Hotel, the publicity man recognized the famous guest from Hollywood and asked if he could make any arrangements. "Yes, I'd like to meet General Pershing," Walt replied. "When I was driving a canteen car in France, I drove his son. And I heard the general give his farewell speech in Paris on the back of a truck. He was my hero, and I'd sure like to meet him." "Well, that's pretty hard to arrange," the publicity man said. "Would you like to see President Hoover instead?" "No, the president's too busy," Walt replied, "and I wouldn't know what to talk to him about. But I would like to see General Pershing." An appointment proved impossible, but Pershing sent an autographed copy of his memoirs. Walt took Lily to see the Washington Monument, Mount Vernon, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Capitol. Then they traveled by train down the Atlantic coast to Key West and boarded a ship for Cuba. They spent a week of sightseeing in Havana, then cruised through the Panama Canal and up the west coast to Los Angeles. Walt and Lily agreed that was the best part of the trip. He strolled around the deck, became acquainted with other passengers on the cruise, spent hours staring at the ship's wake. By the time the ship docked in San Pedro, he was totally relaxed. When Walt returned to work, he remembered the doctor's advice to vary his studio routine with exercise. He went to the Hollywood Athletic Club 2 or 3 times a week for boxing, calisthenics, and swimming. Then he took up golf, rising at 5:30 and playing 9 holes on the Griffith Park course, returning home for a big breakfast before reporting to the studio. He often left work early so he and Lily could ride horseback in the hills behind their home. This was part of the regimen suggested by the doctor. He advised a physical buildup for Walt and Lily as a possible solution to their inability to have a child. All right, that was a long chapter, and deservedly so I'll be brief in my outro. It's, like I said, Easter Sunday, 2020, and the COVID-19 pandemic goes on. It's a nasty, dreary, gray, wet day outside. That's why I'm in here. But, as always, I want to leave y'all with a message of continuing hope and Disney magic. And let's face it, the story of the creation of Mickey Mouse, what better tale of hope do you get? Excuse me, I'm having a hard day. Hold on to each other. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. Instead of our usual outro, I'd like to give you a verse from one of my favorite attractions at Walt Disney World, my brother's as well. There's a great big beautiful tomorrow, shining at the end of every day. There's a great big beautiful tomorrow, and tomorrow's just a dream away. Man has a dream, and that's the start. He follows his dream with mind and heart, and when it becomes a reality, it's a dream come true for you and me. And I think that's about as much as I can get away with without getting slapped with a C and D. Remember, these videos are just for fun. I'm here to help. Oh, I can't not do it. Now it's time to say goodbye to all our company. M-I-C, see you real soon. K-E-Y. Why? Because we like you. M-O-U-S-E. Stay strong, everybody.